This old power sander has the issue of stalling now and again. When this happens, you can hear the motor trying to turn, but instead there is just a struggling hum. When it does work though, it still sounds like something is rattling inside, so I decided to investigate. To open it up, I started by removing the 5 screws on the side. After carefully moving the retainers out of the way, I gently prized apart the 2 halves of the casing. The cable going into the casing was held by a cable grip. I unscrewed this to release the cable. I found a lot of problems with power tools or the motor brushes, so this is the first place I looked. It was hard to see one of the brushes, so I decided to take the machine apart further. After removing the second half of the plastic casing, the rest of the components were easy to separate. One thing I immediately noticed was the sheer amount of dust everywhere. I thought maybe this was jamming the brushes, so I carefully removed the motor brushes and springs and got to cleaning. I used a soft bristled toothbrush to wipe away any dust from the electrical components. For the plastics, I loosely brushed them and then gave them a rinse in water and allowed them to dry. While I went to wash one of the plastic pieces, I noticed one of the corners of where the fan blades were spinning was melted and bent downwards, as you can kind of see here. I figured this might have been the actual problem, so I cut it away with a saw. Once cleaned, I began reassembling the parts, but after putting the rotor back on, which had the fan attached to the rotor shaft, I noticed that plastic part, where there was a bend in the corner, was still rubbing against the fan. This explained why that corner piece had melted, due to friction, so now I had to figure out why this was even happening in the first place. A corner piece of the other half of the casing was also slightly melted and bent, so I carefully straightened it out, as shown here. Maybe this bit was the bit rubbing now and causing the problem? Not quite. Eventually I figured out that what I thought was a spacer between the fan and the bearing wasn't a spacer at all. It was the centerpiece of the bearing that had been dislocated and was pushing the fan up into the plastic. I don't have a footage of this, as my dad stepped in with a bright idea at this point and managed to wedge 2 thin sheets of metal above the centerpiece and gently hammered the sheets so that the piece would fit back into the bearing. Here's a simple illustration. This worked quite well, and now there was enough space for the fan to be dropped down, well clear of the plastic. After double checking there was no contact between the fan blades and the plastic, I began reassembling the components, starting with the rotor in the sanding plate. Next were the springs and brushes back in their compartments and carefully placing the stator piece over the rotor, followed by the rotor cap on top. I put that extracting tube over the hole in the sanding plate and then aligned it with one half of the plastic casing. I checked all of the components were securely fastened in their slots, then secured the cable using the cable grip. The plastic switch grip went back on top, followed by a final check that everything moved correctly without obstruction. The second half of the casing was then put back on, taking care to avoid jamming the sanding belt retainers. Finally, the screws went back in and it was time for a test run. Sounds good. Job done.